Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Strategy, the word itself, goes back to the Greek strategist, the art of the general. It hadn't really been used, at least in the Western world, until the end of the 18th century, partly because of the Enlightenment and an interest in how to describe ideas and practice that would allow you to show that reason can be important even in that most unruly of human affairs, war. It came into being, but then I think was given a tremendous push by Napoleon, by the Napoleonic Wars, and the sense that something big and different was going on, and this military genius, Napoleon, seemed to understand it better than anybody else, and that needed to be explained, and the principles behind that could give you a clue as to how future military campaigns should be organized. There were laws, there were principles at work that guided strategy. Not long after this Napoleonic period, professional revolutionaries who came into being in the 1830s looked back at some of these ideas, read the literature that had been generated around Napoleonic strategy, and started to try to apply it to revolutionary strategy. So you have another strand that comes in from about that period, and those of you who are familiar with radical politics know a lot of the arguments that were set in motion at that period haven't stopped. And then you have the third wave, which comes in much later, when really not until the early 1960s do you find business leaders and those writing for them starting to talk about the need for a strategy. And actually at that point, the literature on strategy takes off. There's a sort of exponential curve of books on strategy. And then, of course, this then moves into all aspects of life. There's no human activity, however intimate now, that doesn't seem to need a strategy of some sort. So that you can have child-rearing strategies, strategies for finding partners, strategies for your tax returns. And one of the interesting questions for me is how do you put bounds on that? How do you describe strategic activity in a way that it's not just a simple way of talking about thinking far ahead or working out what I need to do next? Do you dignify every deliberation as a strategy? Each of these aspects bring in some aspect of my life. Most of my working life has been spent on military issues. I started on nuclear strategy, which is in some ways the hardest strategic discussion of all. But before that, as an undergraduate, and even as a little bit as a graduate, I was very engaged in some of the radical political debates of the late 1960s, when these issues seemed terribly important. And being a pragmatic sort of chap, I worried continuously about how it could ever be that these wonderful ideas that my colleagues were espousing and went to the streets to demonstrate about could ever be turned into practice. And then, as happens in a life, I end up as part of senior management in a university and ending up with strategy in my title. So actually, as a matter of practice, I've had to try to work out how an organisation develops a strategy. And in all of these different areas, scepticism about what strategy could do for you had crept in quite quickly with the on the revolutionary side, but perhaps more gradually on the other side. In each of the areas I've described, the surge of interest in strategy reflected a belief that somehow this was a way by which bright, intelligent, well-informed leaders could control events, how they could face all sorts of challenges and adversity and come out on top, because somehow these people understood what needed to be done, what could be done, better than others. I mentioned already the Napoleonic strategies. The first great interpreter of strategy, not Clausewitz, who came a little afterwards, but Jomini, the Swiss Jomini, who was with the French, never really, throughout a very long life, moved away from the view that if the certain principles were followed, then the clever general, the general of genius, could get to the decisive victory which would win the war. It was a theory of battle and decisive battles, but it was based on optimism that an enemy could be defeated, and once the enemy was defeated, then the state, the enemy state, could be subjugated. Clausewitz, who was probably still the greatest theorist of war, was a little bit more skeptical. But still, he too was taken by this idea of the possibility of the decisive battle. And you can see this idea not withering during the 19th century, but getting more and more of a hold, as particularly the Prussian general staff, who were towards the end of the century more and more successful, could not really think in any other terms but how they would win the war quickly, because they knew a long war would be to their disadvantage, by having a clever strategic plan. Yet by this time, by the end of the 19th century, all the reasons why we know it is difficult for a clever strategic plan always to succeed had become apparent. They'd become apparent even by the time of the fall of Napoleon. They'd become apparent in the Peninsular Campaign as militias appeared, which kept on interrupting the work of the French armies in Spain, and eventually worked with Wellington to have their defeat there. They were very evident in the Borodino campaign, about which Tolstoy wrote, not wholly accurately, but it's noteworthy that Tolstoy used Borodino as essentially to challenge the whole idea of the possibility of strategy. Clausewitz appears in War and Peace in a not wholly flattering light. And there's great skepticism about these German ideas of a science of strategy as to what they could achieve. And Borodino demonstrated the problems that Napoleon faced, first with not fighting when he'd wanted to fight, having to go right into Russia to meet the Russian army, defeating the Russian army, but not sufficiently for it to have to plead for mercy. The Russian army could fight another day, and then he goes to Moscow, the capital city, the symbol of the state. He can take Moscow, but he can't stay there because it's on fire and the population has left, so he has to go home, and we know what happened. And then during the course of the 19th century, you have the example of the American Civil War, which demonstrates how these things can turn into quite bloody battles of attrition. Even before the First World War, which undermined forever the possibility or confidence that with the right strategy you could be sure of victory. Right up to this period, but and to some extent beyond, this idea of the possibility of understanding strategy would allow you to control events and not get yourself into mess, still had a hold. And you may have seen even recently in the press, one of my colleagues at Oxford University, Hugh Strawn, has been arguing the problem is a lack of strategic thinking. If only we had better strategies, Iraq and Afghanistan wouldn't have happened the way they did. But one can question whether the strategy was at fault or whether actually the strategies themselves were always going to be difficult to implement. With revolutionary strategy, again, there was an optimism that you can see in Marx and his followers about what the masses were going to be able to do, the inevitability of their growing strength and seriousness of purpose, the polarization that was going to come, and the question was what was going to be the role of the intellectuals and the professional revolutionaries when the moment came. The revolution was the equivalent of the decisive battle. It was going to be the same stunning moment when you have a transformation from one order to another. Everything was going to be different after the revolution, come the revolution. But, again, the experience eventually told that there were other ways by which the masses might try to meet their objectives. The reformists, the social democrats, saw the virtues of elections, lost interest in revolutions lest they appear too dangerous. Again, the First World War undermined the whole notion of a class interest superseding a national interest when all the socialist parties of the Second International went back and supported their own nations at war. And then with business strategy too, a lot of the original business strategy was based actually on the needs of the big American corporations, in particular General Motors. It was about how these big corporations, which had almost reached the limits of their market share because of antitrust legislation, how do they continue to be profitable? And it was pushed strategic thinking inwards. It was about the organization of the enterprise as much as about how you deal with the external environment. You can trace a lot of the origins of thinking about business business strategy before they actually used the word strategy to a different set of problems, which relates to the previous discussion. It was about how to deal with the labor unions, whether it's sort of Taylorism and time and motion studies, which started before the First World War, or the interwar discussions of the human relations school. It was really about how you deal with labor unrest. But by the 50s, that didn't seem to be the issue anymore. It was about how the corporation could grow. And it didn't really even deal with the issues of competition. It was only as American corporations started to be unnerved by the arrival of serious competition from Europe, from Germany, but most of all from Japan, that the literature began to change and turn and try to address this new set of problems. And that confidence about the ability to control events from the perspective of corporate America of the 1950s is gradually eroded. But what you have again is a series of authors coming forward with propositions about this is the way forward. And I think business strategy, more so than military strategy or political strategy, has suffered from what's often called the gurus, those who come up with a big new idea that will revolutionize the way you do business and ensure growth and seeing off all your competitors. Peter Drucker, who was one of the first great business strategists, said to him, what about the gurus? He was sometimes described as the first guru, said they use the word guru because charlatan's too long to fit on a headline. And I discovered there's a whole academic literature about fads and fashions in strategy, which goes through the speed with which these are taken up and eventually dropped, and asks the question, why do serious executives who are not stupid fall for this each time? To which one answer is, you rarely lose your job by following a fashion. And indeed, if you're seen to be bucking the trend, going against the trend, you can lose your job. So being part of a crowd in that sense can be helpful. So in all these areas, actually strategy never quite fulfills its original promise. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is to point out that maybe we need to think about what strategy can do for you. Ask that question in a slightly different way. The word strategy now, to be strategic, tends to mean to be long-term, to have a keen sense of objectives, to have a clear sense of how you get from where you are at the moment to where you really would like to be. And that sort of thinking can be very valuable. But in practice, it's also very difficult and flawed for a number of reasons. A strategy is not synonymous with a plan. Plans can be very useful, especially in those things you can control. But when you're dealing with other human beings who are willful in their own way, who have their own needs, their own objectives, even if they're notionally on your side, even if they're your employees, but certainly if they're your competitors or your enemies, then it's going to be highly unlikely that a plan is a sequence of events that takes you from one point to another point in a very predictable process is going to be realized. Something is going to happen. The great Prussian strategist who believed in plans nonetheless said, von Moltke, no plan survives contact with the enemy. My much more favorite quote from this, which comes from Mike Tyson, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. It's the same basic theme. Eisenhower once remarked that plans are useless, planning is essential. And I think that's true. The process of thinking ahead is highly useful. But my suggestion is that actually most good strategy is based not on some notional endpoint, but on the problem at hand. What actually is the problem you're trying to solve? In answering that question, you may want to think about where you would like to be. But a lot of the problem at hand is a pretty defensive one because somebody else has taken the initiative. In war, if you've been attacked, victory may seem a good idea, but a better idea is survival. That's the first priority. Then you may be able to start to think about where else you'd like to go. So just as a matter of practice, I think good strategy starts with the here and now and is about getting to the next stage. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because actually the idea of an endpoint, which is captured by the idea of the decisive battle or the revolution, is that that's it. You know, the problem solved. You've won your battle, you've had your revolution. But actually, a whole set of new problems are starting, and how you've got to that point will affect how you deal with the aftermath. You defeat your opponent, but then you've got to run somebody else's state. You win an election, you've got to govern the country. You have a revolution, you've got to implement the new order. You've managed to take over, you've got to merge two companies. And unless you've thought those things through or prepared for the next set of questions you're going to face, you're going to be at a bit of a loss. So the idea of the end point, the ultimate objective, is always misleading. In this sense, I would see strategy, which has its own links with drama. You can think of it as a sort of a story written in the future tense about how things might develop. It's not a three-act play, it's a soap opera. One thing follows another. And if you view it in those terms, then strategy becomes a continual process of updating and responding to events. Now, the thing that makes for the easiest and most successful strategy is simply being stronger than everybody else. It's an obvious point, but it often gets missed. If you've got more resources, then you really ought to win. And if you don't, you've probably screwed up pretty badly. There's this great line from Ecclesiastes about the race doesn't always go to the most swift, or the fight doesn't always go to the most strong, but Damon Runyon had the important rider. They're the ones to bet on. Most of the time, the race does go to the most swift, and the battle does go to the most strong. But it's not very interesting. There's not much intellectual effort in working out how to apply superior resource. So in practice, a lot of the interesting strategy, which is why revolutionary strategy is so interesting, if often so futile, is the underdog, the weakest party. How can the weakest party gain strength? Which is why I think Sun Tzu is so beloved of contemporary strategists, this Chinese sage from 500 BC, who wrote on the art of war with great aphorisms. It's certainly worth reading. But it's basically about being cleverer than your opponent. If you can't outfight them, you can outwit them. Who's not going to enjoy the idea that they're going to be cleverer than everybody else and prove this in some great contest or other? And it's fine until you meet somebody else who's also read Sun Tzu. But it's basically, if you're weaker, you want to appear stronger. If you're stronger, you want to appear weaker. If you're going on the attack, you must make it look like you're going on the defensive. If you're going on the defensive, make it look like you're going on the attack. You get the idea. Well, if everybody's got this same idea, you can never engage at all. There's a role for deception and craftiness and keen intelligence and being smart in all of this. But to my mind, if you look back as to the basis of a lot of success when you're not starting from strength. It's coalition building, finding a partner, finding an ally. It may be difficult, it may involve awkward compromises, but actually that's as often as not the best way to go about things. So to conclude, the history of strategy is to some extent a history of disillusionment. It's a history of attempts to set up scientific ways of thinking about the future that will guarantee certain sorts of results that have always fallen short. But in the process, a lot of very interesting ideas come out, and it focuses your mind onto issues of agency and context and so on in ways that if you're not thinking strategically, you may never come across. If you're aware of that, then your being a good strategist will get you somewhere, as long as you don't think it's going to solve all your problems.
The relationship between the notion of strategy and the notion of uncertainty. Sometimes we see strategy as a way of coping with uncertainty, as it were living with uncertainty, and sometimes we see it as a way of resolving uncertainty, removing uncertainty. It sounds to me as though you're a supporter of the former rather than the latter view.
I think we conceptualise this issue more clearly now than we did in the past, but this was a way by which you could remove uncertainty from your calculations, was always one of the hopes. And it's very strong if you read some of the literature around the managerial revolution of the 50s and 60s, that we've now got a way of achieving a sort of stability in our operations that has eluded those in the past. In the same way, former chancellors have talked about ending the boom and bust cycle, that somehow we've cracked a problem that has eluded people in the past. And they haven't, because in the end, things happen that you're not prepared for, and you get caught out, or there's a complacency develops that sows the seeds of its own destruction. So definitely, I'm about coping with uncertainty, recognizing uncertainty, but in no sense overcoming it.